I remember that afternoon very clearly. The heat in Charleston was suffocating, and the sun filtered through the old oak trees outside, casting patches of light onto the stone-paved street. I, Edward Grant, 65 years old, had just returned from the market, my hands full of heavy paper bags. The straps dug into my skin, leaving red marks like lines marking the course of fate. I sighed, but not because of age. I sighed because I knew when I pushed the door over, I'd be facing a familiar sight, a house that was no longer a home but a bad stage. The door creaked open, the hinges groaning like they were signaling something bad was coming. In the living room, Daniel Carter, my precious son-in-law, was lounging on the armchair. That chair used to be a gift from my wife, Helen, for our 30th wedding anniversary. She chose it because it's as soft as a hug, she said. But now that hug was occupied by a man almost 3 decades younger than me, his feet propped up on the armrest, holding the TV remote like a king ruling his territory. Daniel didn't look up. His eyes were glued to the screen, his voice as commanding as a cheap waiter's. "Father-in-law, grab me a cold beer from the fridge, the one with deep chill." His tone was so casual, it was as if he were ordering at a fast food joint. I stood there, my hands still bearing the red marks from the grocery bag straps, thinking, if he calls me sir next, I might consider him a polite guest. But no, politeness wasn't in Daniel's vocabulary. Before I could respond, Sophie, my daughter, emerged from the kitchen. The light hit her face, a face that used to glow like dawn, now cloaked in tension and cold indifference. She smiled weakly. "Dad, come on, just get it for him." "It's no big deal, no big deal." That phrase cut like a knife. No big deal to turn your father into a servant. No big deal to let another man sit on the chair that your mother once treated like treasure, I wanted to ask, but I just tightened my grip on the grocery bag, placed it on the table, and heard the thud of tomatoes, onions, and beef hitting the table like a farce. The air thickened, only broken by the sound of the TV's static and my heart beating in my chest. I looked at my daughter, waiting for her to see the absurdity. But no, Sophie raised her chin, her eyes grew colder, and then she uttered the words I would never forget for the rest of my life. "Dad, I'll say it straight. Either you stay here and serve my husband or you leave. We can't stand you judging us anymore." It wasn't just an ultimatum, it was a sentence. A sentence from the very child I had raised, working late into the night doing tax calculations, using hands that once laid bricks to rebuild our house after the storm. I didn't shout, I didn't slam my fists on the table, I didn't throw the keys onto the table and scream like some melodramatic scene from the cheap shows Daniel loved to watch. I just smiled, a smile so bitter that even I found it strange on my face. I turned, walked to the bedroom. The suitcase had been waiting in the corner for weeks. I didn't think I had anticipated this. A forensic accountant like me is used to taking notes on everything. Shady transactions, strange accounts, and even the sidelong glances of my own daughter. I pulled the suitcase out, the wheels clattering on the wooden floor, echoing like the drum beats of a funeral march. Daniel snorted, turning back to the screen. Sophie folded her arms, her face as cold as stone. And me, I placed my hand on the door handle, glancing back one last time. Not to beg, not to curse, just to deliver the closing line of this opening act. They think I'm leaving because I lost. But in fact, I've only just started the game. The door slammed shut behind me. The sound of the lock clicking shut was like a solitary applause. I pulled the suitcase, walking out onto the cobblestone street, the sunlight beating down on my back like a challenge. To the passers-by, I was probably just an old man leaving his daughter's house. But if anyone listened carefully, they might hear the faintest hum of a background track starting, softly but surely building up. I know you're sitting somewhere in an armchair in Texas, on a sofa in California, or in a small kitchen in Ohio, and you're hearing this story. You might think, an old man, 65 years old, kicked out of his daughter's house. What's so interesting about that? But I promise you, the game has just begun. And I'm not the type of character to let anyone write the script for me. If you've ever sat before an empty chair that knows more secrets than the person sitting in it, leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Write the city, the town, or even that dusty old place you're sitting in. I'd love to know how far this story of an old man in Charleston can reach. Charleston may be small, but betrayal is never small. And sometimes a quiet smile is the opening move for the longest revenge in a lifetime. They say memories are treasures. The more you hold on to them, the brighter they become. But to me, sometimes memories are like old bank receipts, yellowed, the ink faded, and no one cares about them except me. But if you want to understand why I didn't get angry when Sophie, my only daughter, kicked me out of her house like a tenant whose lease had expired, you need to look at the balance sheet of my life. Trust me, it's as long as an end-of-year financial report, full of expenses and very little income. I started my career with a blackboard and white chalk. For 30 years, I taught history at the local high school. A teacher's salary never made anyone rich, but it was enough to buy bread, gas, and a few old books from the second-hand bookstore by the road. My wife, Helen, understood and accepted that. She would often say, "We may not be rich in money, but we're rich in stories." Right, until she got sick and left far too soon. When Helen passed away, I faced two cold truths: a house that felt empty and a 15-year-old daughter with red, swollen eyes. I had no choice but to become a father, mother, friend, and accountant all at once. Every night I would prepare lessons for my students and then turn to plan a survival guide for Sophie. Fatherly love, that's what they call it. But in reality, it's more like a one-way contract. I'm the only one who signed, and the signature was written in blood and retirement savings. I remember Sophie's college tuition. The school she chose was way up in New England, and the tuition for 1 year was the same as my after-tax annual income. I was about to say, "Sweetheart, maybe you should pick a school in state and save half the cost." But then I remembered Helen's dream for Sophie to fly far. So I gritted my teeth, signed the check, and withdrew from my retirement fund. At that moment, I thought I was investing in her future. Turns out, I was just adding an appendix to that one-way contract. Then came the wedding. God, that wedding was a real show. A white dress, roses imported from Ecuador, and a live jazz band until late at night. I looked at the bill that was longer than my arm and thought to myself, my funeral won't even cost half of this. But Sophie smiled brightly, and Daniel, who was still just a potential son-in-law at that point, hugged me and thanked me like he was signing a corporate merger deal. I mistook that joy for a reward. In truth, it was just the opening act for my asset depreciation phase. The climax came with their house. I withdrew almost all of my retirement savings for the down payment. People say, helping your children build a home is a parent's duty. I just saw myself as a cash machine with gray hair. I tried to comfort myself. At least they'll appreciate it. At least Sophie will understand. Ha! I was such a naive teacher, thinking that students always remember their teachers' efforts. You see, every expense, every item, I checked off in my life's ledger. Tuition, check. Wedding, check. Down payment, check. All of it added up to one big number: my old age. They call it fatherly love. I call it a one-way contract with no signature from me. Then one day, I realized that everything I gave wasn't seen as love anymore. It turned into an obligation, an expectation. It was as if I were born just to carry their financial burdens, without any right to expect the slightest kindness. When Daniel ordered me to get him a beer, Sophie didn't see it as disrespect. She just saw it as normal, because in her eyes I had long been the servant. It hurts, not like a sudden sharp knife, but like 1,000 tiny pricks that never stop. The memories of nights spent by the desk, the dim light reflecting off the pages of my budgeting book, calculating every penny so Sophie could have a plane ticket to come home, now felt like a bitter joke. Everything I called sacrifice was now framed as duty, no longer love, no longer gratitude. I remember when Sophie was little, sitting on my shoulders at the fair, holding a blue balloon, singing happily. At that time, I thought, this is the first return on my investment in love. But as time passed, that balloon became just a memory. I watched my daughter grow up, but instead of a smile, I was met with a cold stare. The moment she gave me the ultimatum, I realized every emotional report in my ledger had been depreciated. There was nothing left to deduct. I was just a debt to be cleared, and they wanted to erase me from the books by throwing me out the door. Outsiders would say I was weak, but really, that silence was the only way I could hold on to my dignity. I'd spent my whole life as a teacher, telling my students that history always repeats itself. Empires that are too greedy collapse on their own. So now, all I had to do was sit back, observe, and wait. I didn't leave my daughter's house because I lost. I left because I realized that the one-way contract had finally reached its expiration date. And this time, the one holding the ledger wasn't Sophie, wasn't Daniel, it was me. The ledger in my hands was no longer a list of a devoted father's expenses. It was about to become the journal of a silent, long-lasting, and legal revenge. I didn't need applause, I didn't need pity. Just a blue ink pen, and the memory of a teacher who had graded thousands of papers. Trust me, I'm about to grade the final exam for those two, and the score will definitely be F. I didn't leave with the tragic look you see in movies. No heart-wrenching soundtrack, no scene of me stumbling through the rain. Just a 65-year-old man dragging a suitcase through the street, checking into a cheap seaside motel where the smell of salt mixed with mildew in the sheets, and the TV only got 3 channels. The room was small, the bed sagged, and the window wouldn't close. But it had an electrical outlet, shaky Wi-Fi, and a desk just big enough for my laptop. That was good enough for me. I set my suitcase in the corner, brewed some instant coffee in the chipped plastic mug, then sat down. As the laptop screen lit up, I saw my own reflection. More wrinkles, streaks of gray in my hair, but my eyes still bright, like I was walking into my first classroom after summer vacation. I wasn't Edward Grant, the mild-mannered teacher anymore. I was Edward Grant, a forensic accountant in my own family. I opened the account list, the Excel sheet I had been updating for years. Every column, every row, wasn't just a record of love anymore. It had become a battlefield. What I was about to do, I called shutting off the financial valve. They thought I was just a smiling ATM. Well then, let's see how I unplug it. First click, cancel the mortgage auto pay. The fancy house Sophie and Daniel were living in was the one I had used my retirement savings for as a down payment. Over the years, I had carefully kept up with the monthly payments, but now that I was leaving, why should I keep feeding the lifeblood into that betraying body? I hovered over the mouse and clicked, cancel recurring payment. The bank popped up with, "Are you sure?" I chuckled. "Lady," I muttered, "I've never been more sure in my life." Click. The screen flashed a success notification. The ding sounded sweeter than the church choir Helen used to love. Second click. Cancel the car insurance. Daniel had begged me to add his name to the family insurance policy to lower the rates. I agreed, thinking, fine, I'll help my son-in-law a bit. Now, it was lighter because I cut it. I deleted his name, keeping only my old sedan. When the screen flashed, policy updated, I wrote the confirmation code down in my notebook. I marked the number and crossed it out in red. Just like grading a cheating student's paper, this time, Daniel was getting an F. Third click. Remove Sophie from the authorized users list. For years, she was used to swiping my card at the grocery store, the spa, even the imported flower shop. Each time I got the statement, I'd furrow my brow and think, it's my daughter, I'll let it slide. But after that ultimatum, letting it slide, expired. I clicked, remove authorized user. The message appeared. This user will no longer have access to this account. I snorted. Not only does she no longer have access to the account, she no longer has access to my heart. With each click, I heard it like nails on a chalkboard, sharp but decisive. Each confirmation, each success notification, I jotted it down in my notebook like a diligent teacher. This time, the students weren't high schoolers, but my own daughter and son-in-law, who had treated me like a waiter. And the final grade? A number that wasn't rounded off. I sat there quietly for a few minutes, hearing the waves crash outside, the smell of salt wafting in through the window. In this cheap motel room, I felt freer than I had in years. People think money is just a number, but to me, each number is a message. When I canceled autopay, cut the insurance, and removed the authorized card. I wasn't just stopping the spending. I was sending a clear message. This is no longer a one-way contract. This is the day of expiration. I remembered all those times Daniel would lounge in the living room, talking about investments and cash flow. He'd draw graphs on napkins, acting like the Einstein of Wall Street. I usually stayed quiet, sipping my coffee, thinking, "Kid, I've been living off ledgers for 30 years. Your little pencil math only deserves a C+. Don't think you can fool anyone." Sophie was the same. She'd gotten used to living in the shelter of my protection, confusing love with obligation. She didn't understand that every ledger has two columns, give and receive. She'd only filled in my give column and treated her receive column as a given. So today, I did the work of a fair teacher. Crossed out in red, marked with big letters, and lowered the grade. As night fell, I closed the laptop, carefully tucking my notebook into the suitcase. I poured the last of the cold coffee into the cup and took a sip. Bitter, but familiar. I looked out the window, seeing the flashing lights of the boats out at sea. In this shabby motel, I smiled to myself. They think I'm just an old man leaving the house, dragging a suitcase like a failure. They don't know that right now, each click I made has turned money into a blade that doesn't need blood, just an email confirmation from the bank. And this bittersweet joy, oh, it's sweeter than any gospel song on a Sunday. This translation follows your model for retaining the tone and flow, ensuring the natural rhythm and language of an American audience, while staying true to the original meaning. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments. They say betrayers often leave clues not because they're reckless, but because they're foolish. I wasn't planning on looking for more evidence, but life has a strange way of placing the right pieces in the right spots. One rainy afternoon, I walked past a local bank branch to close an old account. At the customer service desk, I ran into Frank Holloway, a former colleague from my economics teaching days. After retiring, Frank switched to doing internal auditing for the banking system. His hair was completely white, but his eyes still sparkled like when he used to grade student papers. "Edward Grant, my goodness, I thought you disappeared." Frank laughed and slapped me on the back. We went to a nearby cafe. I briefly explained my recent life. My wife passed, my daughter married a damn fool of a son-in-law, and in the end, I was kicked out of my own house. Frank listened, frowning. Then he leaned in, lowered his voice like he was about to share a state secret. "Edward, I've got something. I'm not sure I should tell you, but since that house is still in your name, I think you need to know." I took a sip of my cold coffee and nodded. "Go ahead." After 40 years of teaching, no truth can be worse than a student's misspelled essay handed in with Comic Sans. Frank chuckled, then pulled out his phone and showed me a few PDF files. I glanced over and saw my signature, messy but familiar, on a mortgage document. The thing is, I never signed it. Daniel Carter brought these papers to the bank last month. He submitted a refinancing application for the lake house, claiming repairs and upgrades. But the thing is, the documents are full of mistakes. Your signature is forged, and even the old ID number is wrong. I couldn't help but laugh out loud, causing some nearby customers to look over. "Frank, I've been teaching for 40 years and grading thousands of papers, but I've never seen a student so stupid as to forge documents at their teacher's house." Frank shrugged. He thought you were old and wouldn't notice. The bank was about to approve it, but luckily, I double-checked. I noticed the errors, so I put a hold on it. "But Edward, this is serious. He's using your house as bait." The word bait echoed in my head. I asked straight out, "What does he need the money for?" I thought he was too lazy to do anything but watch TV. Frank sighed. "Sports betting. The debts piled up, at least tens of thousands of dollars. Edward, if this paperwork went through, your house would have been a chip on his gambling table." I sat still for a few seconds. That lake house wasn't just an asset. It was where Helen and I grew flowers, where Sophie used to run around as a kid, and Daniel was planning to turn it into a bet for a Liverpool-Manchester game? What a farce. I shook my head sarcastically. This world is really strange. I used to teach my students that human history was built on blood, sweat, and tears. Meanwhile, Daniel Carter wants to rewrite history with betting slips and forged documents. Evolution doesn't always go in a straight line. That night, back at the motel, I opened my laptop. I gathered all the e-receipts, email screenshots, and the scan of the forged documents Frank sent me. I filed them into one folder, naming it Homework. A fitting name, because this time, Daniel's homework would be submitted to the police for grading. The next morning, I headed to the Charleston Police Headquarters. The Civil Complaints Department was empty, only the hum of the air conditioner filling the silence. The officer at the desk looked at me, then at the thick stack of documents I set down. I spoke plainly. My son-in-law forged the mortgage documents for the house in my name. He's using that property to take out loans to pay off gambling debts. I want to file a formal report. The officer nodded, taking out paper and pen. Do you have proof? I pushed my laptop toward him, opened the Homework folder. The files popped up, one by one, clear and organized. The forged signature, the wrong ID number, the email exchanges about the loan. The officer whistled. That's enough. We'll forward this to the Financial Investigation Department. Thank you, Mr. Grant. I smiled. Thanks, but I'm just grateful life gave me the skill to grade papers carefully. That's how I can spot which student copied whose work. When I left the headquarters, I stood outside, watching the light rain fall. I took a deep breath, feeling like I had just taught a difficult lesson, and my students still understood. I didn't need to shout at Daniel. I didn't need to drag Sophie into this. I just needed to place the right papers on the right desk. From there, the machine would run on its own. That night, back at the motel, I sat in front of my laptop, opened the Homework folder again. I added a new file, the police report confirming Daniel Carter was under investigation. I numbered it and highlighted the title in red. To me, it was like grading the final exam. And as I said before, Daniel's grade was a big fat F. I leaned back in the chair, took a sip of the cold coffee, and thought to myself, maybe I should send him a copy with a note. Needs improvement. Retake the course from the beginning. Then I laughed quietly, the sound echoing in the small room, drowning out the sound of the waves outside the window. Charleston isn't New York. Here, if a dog barks 3 times, the whole block will be talking about it. An old man riding his bike late on a Sunday morning becomes the coffee shop conversation for the whole week. So, just imagine how fast the story of Mr. Grant getting kicked out by his daughter and son-in-law, then his son-in-law being investigated by the police for fake documents spread. Yeah, faster than the Wi-Fi signal at the motel I'm staying at. The morning after I filed my report at the police station, I stopped by my usual coffee shop. Small, with red brick and a sign faded from the Clinton presidency. As soon as I walked in, I heard the whispers. A group of housewives stirred their spoons in their cups, glancing over at me and whispering, "Did you hear? Mr. Grant spent his whole life paying tuition for his kid, paying for the wedding, and even took money out of his retirement to pay for the house. And yet when she said, 'No,' heartless, her voice dropped, drawn out like she was reading a funeral prayer. I didn't stop to hear more. I just smiled, ordered an iced black coffee, and sat in my usual corner. Gossip spreads like gunpowder. Once it catches fire, no one can put it out. I thought it would stop at the coffee shop. But at the barber's, I heard it again. Joe, the barber, was cutting a new customer's hair, his hands moving faster than breaking news. Daniel Carter? If he were rich, I'd be a billionaire by now. His debts are through the roof, and he drives a fancy car to show off. Fake documents? Well, if he keeps that up, he'll be heading straight for a jail cell. The whole shop laughed. I stayed quiet, my newspaper half covering my face, revealing only the corner of my mouth, which was twitching with a smile. I didn't need to speak. In a town like Charleston, every barber's chair is like a live broadcast. On Sunday, I went to church. The priest looked at me with a bit of awkwardness but nodded slightly. After the service, a few old ladies came up to me, shaking my hand warmly while whispering, "Mr. Grant, we've heard it all. We feel for you, but you did the right thing. No one should have to live being treated as a burden by their own child. People should be grateful, not take advantage. I just nodded and smiled. If you pay attention, you'll see that I don't need to preach. The small town itself turned into a newsroom, with every person a pen writing my story across hundreds of invisible pages. At the market, my neighbor chimed in. She sighed loudly enough for the people around her to hear. His whole life, he worked to support his daughter, paid for every penny, and now she turns her back on him. And Daniel? If I thought he knew how to make money, I'd be a billionaire by now. I almost laughed out loud at that one. In a small town, no need for a newsroom, just a nosy neighbor. I remember when I was teaching, students dreaded oral exams. They called them gossip killers for their reputation. Now I realize gossip is stronger than any verdict. I didn't stand up, I didn't send complaint letters, I didn't go to the press, and yet, everyone in Charleston knew Daniel forged documents, and Sophie was an ungrateful daughter. That's the sweetness of a small town. I didn't need TV time, didn't need a microphone. Charleston produces free news 24/7. And best of all, no one pays for ads. Of course, not everyone stood by me. Some folks like to spice things up. They called me rigid, not willing to open up. They whispered, maybe mister. Grant has some fault too. Otherwise, why would his daughter do that? I listened, then chuckled. People always need a script with enough roles, victim, villain, and a little ambiguity. But in the end, the truth prevails. Fake documents are undeniable. One evening, I sat on the motel porch, listening to two young men walk by. They didn't see me, but I heard them clearly. Hey, did you hear Daniel Carter's being investigated? The lake house isn't his, it's his father-in-law's. Dumb, right? Yeah, and his wife, Sophie, defends him so much. But the folks around here, they won't stay quiet. Mr. Grant's the teacher for half the town. Everyone knows what he's like. I leaned back in my chair, inhaling the salty sea breeze, and smiled. Yes, I used to be the teacher for half this town. And now, half this town is doing an even better job, becoming a choir, telling my truth. They say, in today's world, you need social media to make a story spread. But in Charleston, you just need the barber's chair, the coffee shop, the church, and the nosy neighbor. Gossip spreads quickly, takes root, and seeps into every corner. Daniel and Sophie can lock their doors, but every time they step outside, they'll hear their names in the stories of others. And that's the sweetest punishment. Not the court's verdict, but the community's verdict. I didn't need the newspaper, the microphone, or long articles. This town had become a free news channel, updating hourly, spreading the truth farther than any public loudspeaker. I just sit still, drink coffee, and let the Charleston news air. They thought I left because I lost. In reality, every whisper in the coffee shop, every jab in the barber's chair, was another click in my ledger. And the result? Daniel and Sophie are losing credibility, not just with the bank, but right here in the town where they live. Charleston is a small town, and avoiding a confrontation is difficult. I originally thought I could sit quietly and let the rumors spin like a windmill. But Daniel Carter, the talented son-in-law of someone, definitely not mine, decided to make a dramatic move. That Saturday, in the square in front of the church, he stood amidst the crowd, puffing himself up like a victor ready to wave the flag. I was just there to buy some vegetables at the market. But fate has its own way of setting up its plays. As I walked by, he suddenly spoke loudly enough for the entire crowd to stop and look up. This old man, Daniel pointed directly at me, his voice as sharp as if he were in court. He's losing his mind. He's senile, weak, and making up stories to slander me. Who could believe an old fool sitting in a motel, fabricating all sorts of things? The crowd gasped. I saw a few skeptical eyes turn toward me. For a moment, I could clearly hear the squeak of my vegetable cart on the pavement. I stopped, set my bag down, and looked up at him. My heart didn't beat faster. 40 years of teaching had trained me to remain silent in the face of chaos. I spoke slowly, letting each word fall like a stone into the still water. Daniel, I said sharply, Have you paid the $20,000 in gambling debt yet? The air thickened. The murmurs began to spread, growing like ripples on water. Someone stopped buying roasted corn. Someone else halted midway through a pie. The crowd shifted like a class when the teacher asks a question everyone knows the answer to, except the student being called on. Daniel's face turned red. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. A shrug? A denial? No, he stood frozen, sweat forming on his forehead. I continued, my voice laced with mockery, light as a sea breeze. The crowd doesn't need a judge. They just need a number. And $20,000 is enough to sink you deeper than the Charleston Sea. The square erupted. I heard someone whistle. An old woman behind me muttered, I knew it. An old man by the fish stall yelled, 20,000. Has that house been sold yet for him to spend like that? Daniel took a step back. He tried to speak. That's nothing. Just some numbers don't mean anything. I cut him off. Fake documents, borrowing from the bank with a house that isn't yours, does that count as nothing? The silence that followed was no longer doubt. It felt like a verdict. I looked around and saw the shift in everyone's gaze. They weren't scrutinizing me anymore. They were seeing him as the thief caught in the act. Sophie appeared then, her face pale. She rushed to Daniel's side, pulling his arm, voice trembling. Stop, Daniel. Let's go. But he shrugged her off, eyes wild. He didn't realize the fight was already over before he even opened his mouth. In my teaching days, I'd seen students try to wriggle out of cheating accusations. Same, old script. Red faces, sweat, shaky voices. The only difference now was that, instead of an F, Daniel would face public ridicule in front of the whole town. The news spread faster than any email I'd ever sent. By afternoon, I sat in a cafe, overhearing someone recount the scene like it was a sports match. Grant asked one question, and Daniel was speechless. $20,000, gambling, he's done for. Another added, the real estate company won't hold on to him. Who'd want to do business with someone who's in hidden debt? Sure enough, 2 days later, Daniel's company announced his termination. Official reason? Damage to reputation. But the whole of Charleston knew the truth. Creditors didn't need a formal report. They knocked on Sophie's door the very next evening. I stood at the motel porch, watching the night sky, feeling the wind from the sea. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt that my ledger had one more balanced line. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to write long articles. Just one number, $20,000, was enough for the crowd to decide his fate. They say justice needs courts, but in a small town, sometimes justice just needs a square, a question, and a crowd willing to listen. And this time, the lesson was clear. Never challenge the teacher in front of the class, unless you've already done your homework. Daniel had never done his, and his grade, as you might guess, was a flat 0. I originally thought my daughter Sophie would try to hang on a little longer, clinging to the illusory shell of happiness for a few more months. But when Daniel was fired, creditors started knocking at the door, and the town's gossip tore through the layers of false pretenses. Sophie had nowhere left to hide. One late afternoon, I was sitting on the motel porch, sipping on a weak cup of coffee, when I heard a rapid knock on the door. I opened it. Sophie was standing there, mascara smeared, eyes red. She rushed into the room like someone parched, finally finding water. Dad, she choked, her voice breaking. Please come home. I beg you. Daniel lost his job. They're demanding money. I don't know what to do. I sat on the bed, looking at the daughter I once carried in my arms, now trembling like a student standing before the board, unprepared. I didn't rush to hug her. I let the silence sink in. Then I spoke slowly, my tone calm, like a teacher reading out an exam prompt. Sophie, if you want me to come home, you have to do one thing. Not for me, but for yourself. She looked up, her eyes pleading. Anything, Dad. I'll do anything. I nodded. You will publicly admit the truth. To the community, to those you've allowed Daniel to deceive with the perfect family facade. If you want to regain even a little dignity, this is the only way. Sophie looked horrified, as if I had just asked her to jump into the sea. She shook her head furiously. No, Dad, I can't. Everyone will hate me. I'll lose all my friends, I interrupted her. You've already lost them. What remains is a chance to stand tall, at least once. I don't need an apology in private. I need you to say it in front of everyone. If not, don't come looking for me. She collapsed onto the chair, hands over her face. I didn't comfort her. I let her cry, like a student who hadn't done their homework, yet still had to hand in a blank sheet. That Sunday, Charleston was more crowded than usual. I guess everyone had heard the rumor. Mr. Grant has given his daughter an ultimatum, and they wanted to witness it firsthand. The church, usually only large enough for a few hundred people, was packed with people spilling out into the yard. I sat in the back row. Sophie stepped up to the pulpit, the microphone trembling in her hands. Her beige dress looked wrinkled, her face pale. The entire church was silent, the only sound being the steady hum of the ceiling fan. Sophie took a deep breath and began. You all have probably heard the rumors, but today I want to tell the truth. Her voice was shaky, but each word rang clear. She spoke about how my husband raised her alone after her mother passed, paid for her college tuition, covered expenses for her lavish wedding, and withdrew from his retirement savings to make the down payment for their house. She admitted Daniel was wrong, and she, too, had been wrong for staying silent and complicit. She spoke about the ultimatum in the living room. Dad, either serve my husband or leave the house. And when she mentioned this, her voice cracked like breaking glass. The whole church held its breath. I looked around, seeing the stern faces of the elderly, a few eyes misting with tears. Then, after a long pause, whispers of sympathy began to spread. An elderly woman nodded. At least she had the courage to admit it. A neighbor shook his head. Mister, Grant didn't deserve this. I didn't stand up. I didn't need to. I simply sat there, listening, allowing my daughter to learn the last lesson I couldn't teach in class. They call it confession. I call it the final bill. And this time, it couldn't be paid with my credit card. When Sophie put the microphone down, the church stayed quiet for a few more beats. Then the priest stepped up, placed a hand on her shoulder and said briefly, You did the right thing. The murmurs faded. A few people clapped gently, not the boisterous applause, but a quiet acceptance. Sophie walked down, her shoulders still shaking, but her face lighter than before. She searched for me in the crowd. I nodded, neither smiling nor frowning. Just a nod from a teacher when a student finally hands in their paper. Late, but enough. After the ceremony, I walked out onto the porch where the sea breeze blew through. Sophie followed me, her eyes still red. Dad, I did what you asked. Will you come home now? I turned to her and placed my hand on her shoulder. I won't go back to that house. Home isn't just four walls. Home is where the truth is. You've just rebuilt your foundation. Hold on to it. Don't let it crumble again. She nodded, tears falling freely, but in her eyes there was a glimmer of light. Perhaps for the first time in years, Sophie truly understood the value of responsibility. As for me, I returned to the motel, but I felt lighter. Not because Daniel would face legal consequences or because Sophie had confessed publicly, but because my ledger, the balance sheet of my life, finally had one entry: truth. Paid. Daniel Carter vanished from Charleston like a passing storm, leaving only cracked roofs, broken windows, and endless whispers. Some said he fled to Atlanta to work as a janitor. Others swore they saw him in Savannah applying for a job as a cargo handler. I didn't care where he went, as long as he was no longer standing in my living room, spouting lies, thinking the world would applaud him. This small town doesn't forget easily, and for him, Charleston had already slammed the door shut long ago. Sophie was different. She didn't run. She faced it. I saw her start therapy, slowly stepping out from under the shadow of a man she had chosen. The first time she called me, her voice trembling, she said, Dad, I don't know if I can make up for anything, but I want to try. I stayed silent, then replied, No one can change the past, but you can learn not to repeat it. Therapy is a mirror. If you dare to look, you'll see. From then on, Whenever she visited the cabin, with eyes a little less burdened, I knew at least she was beginning the right path. As for me, I made a decision many people called too final. I donated the house to a scholarship fund at the high school where I once taught. That house had witnessed my tears, Helen's smile, Sophie's first cries. But it had also witnessed ultimatums, betrayal, and nights spent alone in front of an empty chair. I wanted it to have a new life, unbound by tragedy. When I signed the papers, the principal said, "Mr. Grant, you're leaving behind a great legacy for the children." I just smiled. Don't call it a legacy, call it a ticket. I once paid for my daughter's ticket and she threw it away. Let the kids have it. Maybe one will get on a train to places their parents never dared to dream. I imagine one day a poor kid will walk into a university classroom on the Helen Grant Scholarship. When they ask, "Who is Helen?" someone will say, "She was a woman who believed in knowledge and a husband who refused to let love be buried under greed. And I chose to live in a small cabin by the sea. No amenities, no TV, no one yelling for a beer or ordering commands. Every morning I brew coffee, sit on the porch and watch the waves crash like my own silvering hair. In the afternoon, I count the seagulls flying by, sometimes perched on the railing, staring at me as if to ask, "Old man, have you learned anything from life yet?" I nod. I've learned, my feathered friends. After 65 years, I've finally learned the most important lesson. An ATM card that can walk will never love you truly. In the evenings, I read under the yellow light, the waves providing the soundtrack. Some say it's a lonely life, but I don't feel lonely. After a lifetime of service, I finally learned what it means to live for myself. In fact, the worst kind of loneliness is sitting in the middle of a family and still feeling invisible. The small cabin, the loud waves, the bitter coffee, that's my— I think betrayal is the end, but I believe betrayal is a test, exposing what we once blindly believed was love or devotion. When my daughter issued her ultimatum, when my son-in-law forged the house papers, when the whole town buzzed with gossip, I realized one truth: silence and walking away at the right time is the sharpest weapon. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to slam the table or persuade anyone to stand by me. All I needed was a smile, a suitcase, and patience. And what happened? The betrayer fell apart. The one who once saw me as a burden had to confess before the whole church. The house they tried to take became a scholarship for the next generation. And I, the one once kicked out of my own home, now had more freedom and peace than ever. That's the essence of justice. No noise, no bloodshed, just the truth brought to light, and the one who trembles under that light becomes the laughingstock. If you've listened this far, I want to leave you with this. Don't let anyone turn your love into a one-sided contract. Don't let anyone use your kindness like an endless ATM. And when faced with betrayal, remember, you don't need to yell to win. Sometimes, all you need is silence, and time and truth will do the rest. If you believe this story shows that sometimes a smile and a suitcase are more powerful than 1,000 arguments, then hit subscribe and turn on the bell. Here, you'll find more stories where the betrayer falls, and the ones once looked down on rise up, smiling as they walk away. Trust me, there's nothing more satisfying than watching someone who once belittled you turn into the punchline. And if you're watching from anywhere, leave your city in the comments. I want to know how far the story of this old man from Charleston has traveled. Maybe, from my small cabin by the sea, my waves will reach your living room.